Direction Point! Direction Point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network, and my name is Jason. I am reminded by Jason Davis that because I split this episode in half, let's pretend that we're now 700 years in the future. We rejoin the Ark at the end of its journey. I am out of town this week, recording on a backup headset with a weak microphone, so pardon the audio quality. I will keep these opening remarks brief. After Leland joined us 700 years ago, Jim Sangster is my guest this week. In an interview recorded after 73 yards and a week before Dot and Bubble, the latter of which I'll review at the end of my audio essay on the Ark novelization. I record this one day after Dot and Bubble premiered for the first time. We do have 3 episodes left in the first RTD Disney Plus Ncuti Gatwa season. Let's get to it.
They all say, who is Doctor Who?
This is Tim Trelaw.
This is David J. Howe.
I'm Peter Purvis.
I am Sadie Miller.
This is Lauren Cornelius.
Larry, it's Fraser.
For all things in the Doctor Who collecting world and beyond, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. I'm Larry Van Mersbergen, your host, and I've been collecting for 42 years. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature on the Direction Point Podcast Network. Keep turning the pages.
Jim Sangster, when it comes to talking about the Ark, there's only one topic to discuss, and that is the fact that the monoids wear Beatles wigs. And if we're talking about the Beatles, there's only one person that I can have on the show. That is you. How are you, Jim?
Well, you could have got Graham. You could have got Graham Burke. He did an actual podcast about the Beatles, which I guessed on. I'm doing well, thank you. How's yourself?
I made the mistake of trying to start 73 yards at 11:30 last night with my kid, and we both made it about 15 minutes in, so we had to finish this morning on the Saturday. And I'm not going to say that I didn't understand it, but I needed her, the 13 going on 14-year-old, to explain the ending to me.
I had a similar thing. Like a lot of people in the UK, I'm staying up until midnight, way past my bedtime, just so that I can watch these episodes without getting spoiled. And I'd also, because of a last-minute change in schedule, I was able to go out last night, so I was also a bit drunk. So I was watching the thing just going, I don't understand what's going on, and I'm sure it will all be explained later. So that's my non-spoiler review.
My kid understood the time jumps long before I understood the time jumps. She understood the significance of the 73 yards and Ruby on the football pitch in Cardiff long before I did. She understood the identity of the 73-yard lady long before I did. So this is now Doctor Who being made for a younger generation that can understand these things, and I remain somewhat behind the times.
I think part of the episode for me was frustrating when I realised that it wasn't just going to be set in the pub. I was really looking forward to a folk horror story. That's what I thought we were going to get. I thought it was going to be some sort of scary thing approaching the pub, and it'd be like a base on the siege thing. As ever, when you try and anticipate stuff, often you build up the thing in your head before it arrives, and because it's not that, you feel disappointed. So now that I know what it is, in the same way that Gridlock, somebody who wrote for Doctor Who that year, told me that Gridlock had the Macra in, and I started having an idea of what the story might be like. And then when I saw that Gridlock, I hated it. It just wasn't the story I was waiting for, and it took me about 2 years to actually realise Gridlock is beautiful. So maybe this one will change. I'll change my opinion on it.
When Village of the Angels premiered, I was at LI Who that weekend, and people who had watched it in their hotel rooms through various extra-legal means before I went home to watch it myself said this is the best episode Doctor Who's ever made. And I spent 20 minutes waiting for the great episode to start, and then I spent 20 minutes waiting for the great episode to finish, and I didn't enjoy any of it. Similarly, I was out as well yesterday evening, and
I had seen a couple of non-spoilery reviews describing 73 Yards as the best episode Doctor Who has ever done. And it was very good, but I can't say that it was the best episode Doctor Who's ever done because I didn't quite grasp it.
I get the impression that this is another one of those Russell things where, as I said, a bit like The Long Game, where you watch it and you don't quite realise what the significance is until everything's revealed at the end. So hopefully this will all be explained later. But at the moment, I enjoyed what it was, but because I didn't really understand what was going on, and it I think deliberately didn't explain it. And I don't really think I should probably talk more about that, just in case I accidentally stumble on what the thing actually is. I've got an idea.
Having been placed on the back foot by RTD, I need to get myself out on the front foot. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to challenge you to a game.
Uh-oh.
And the game we are going to play this week is a book that I have, and I'm pretty sure you don't. It is the second Doctor Who quiz book by Nigel Robinson from 1983. And we are going to pick a quiz from this book, which you have probably never read, or if you did, it was decades ago. And I'm going to pick a quiz that is tangentially related to the arc, but it's not going to be Adventures of the First Doctor, because that would be too easy. Since the arc is about the end of history, we're going to pick a quiz called The Earth in Danger, Section 1, page 18, for those of you keeping score at home. We're going to do the first 5 questions. 3 out of 5 is passing. 5 out of 5, you will earn the people's ovation and fame forever. Are you ready to play?
You said the second Doctor Who quiz book, yeah?
Yes, because I don't have the first.
Oh, okay. And what was that, page 18?
Well, for those of you keeping score at home, yes.
Okay.
Now, Jim, you have assured me that you don't have this book, so we will just try to play the quiz. Question 1. How many days' journey from Earth was Monarch's ship when the TARDIS landed there?
4.
Well, that's a pretty dead giveaway for a Doomsday, but still, you've got 1 down, 4 to go. Let's see how you do. Question 2. Who finally destroyed Boss and ended its plans for world domination?
Stevens, the head of Global Chemicals, who had been taken over by the computer. He was shown the error of his ways by the Doctor with the help of the blue crystal from Metebelis 3.
That's very good. In fact, it's word for word the answer that Nigel Robinson gave on page 75. You promised me that you don't have this. Are you sure you don't have this book?
No.
Let's turn back to page 18. I'll ask you the next question. Jim, I can hear you flicking pages.
I've got an itch.
Jim, you have the book.
This is the second Doctor quiz.
Are you
book.
cheating? Are you cheating on a Doctor Who literature quiz?
No.
We are cheating on. How low can you go to cheat on a Doctor Who literature quiz?
I just wanted to replicate the incredibly convincing monoid who was asked, "Are you up to something?" And he goes, "No." I apologise. I've put the book away now, but I think I've probably ruined the moment. Anyway, yeah monoid, Beatles, they're great, aren't they?
We're not quizzing anymore. All right, so why? Now, in TARDIS Eruditorum, the theory is made that this is Doctor Who's attempt to alienate youth culture and make fun of the kids. I think that's a bit of a stretch, given that the costume designers probably were not being that meta. But why are the monoids wearing Beatles wigs in 1966?
Well, the practical reason is because they needed ventilation so that the actors could breathe through the top of the skull of the costume, because it's a very heavy, very rubbery costume. But also, I don't know why the wigs are beetly. Maybe it's a coincidence, but once you realise that they're quite beetly, they're really beetly, and it is really distracting. But it just makes it the most kind of 1966 episode it could possibly be. I think the stranger thing is that they just cast Dodo, and you might remember in the last episode of The Massacre, Dodo comes in with a broad Mancunian accent. She sounds like Sheila Delaney characters, A Taste of Honey or Coronation Street or something like that. And she's like, "Where's your phone?" And she's got a proper Manchester accent, which is completely gone a week later when she hits the Ark. Which makes me suspect that maybe Dodo has had a few adventures, but she just hasn't travelled in time yet, or she's travelled in time but hasn't travelled in space, or whatever. But she seems to not understand that they've gone somewhere and it's a different day or whatever. But also, just getting back to the Beatles, they're trying to make Dodo a cool character. I mean, first of all, she's the first companion who's actually cast, I think, to be a companion, to do the job of being a companion, rather than being a companion, a character who is also a companion. She just walks in, she goes, right, I'm the new girl, let's get on with it, and we start her adventures. But I don't understand why they didn't cast a Liverpool actress. I know that Maureen O'Brien was a Liverpool actress, but she wasn't playing Liverpool. Because she's got a little John Lennon cap later on in the season, and she's using lots of slang, and in the book especially, I think she's brilliant in the book because she's really annoying the Doctor with all of her slang. But it's strange that they go for Manchester rather than Liverpool, and then it's even stranger that 1 week in they just completely bottle it and decide, actually, can you do RP? I don't understand that decision. I've not yet read David Brunt's production diaries book. I've just received it, so maybe the answer's in there.
Yeah, I don't have that yet either. That's going to be a deep dive for a later date. So she has one accent in the Massacre Part 4. She has another accent in the Ark Parts 1 and 2. And then after that, she has her third accent.
Yeah, which is sort of in between. You can hear some of her flat northern vowels occasionally, but she's also, by the time of the War Machine, she's really RP. She's really posh. It's lovely in the first one going, are you a policeman? And she's like, where's your phone? And I'm not bothered, my great aunt won't miss me or whatever. She's just she's straight out of A Taste of Honey,
which I of course have not seen. My recollection is that from what I read in fan books, reference books in the 80s, that she was supposed to be a Cockney. Is that accurate?
I think it's a misunderstanding. So I don't know whether, I'm assuming it's Jeremy Bentham because he's the pathfinder of a lot of these things. And I'm assuming he found some sort of reference that they've changed their accent, but assumed it was Cockney and wrote it down as it was a Cockney. She's not remotely Cockney. I don't think she's ever Cockney. The only thing that's Cockney about her, in fact, no. Even the location they shoot her very first scene on, it's Wimbledon, which is, it's not the East End. It's not proper Cockney. So yeah, there's nothing remotely Cockney about her.
I think it was the Revenge of the Cybermen DVD and the making of documentary for Revenge of the Cybermen. They showed correspondence with Jerry Davis, which actually showed Jerry Davis's home address circa 1974 on screen. So I freeze framed the DVD and I Googled the home address. Jerry Davis lived across the street from Wimbledon in 1974. It's right there on Google Maps.
Which would have been quite noisy every summer.
Exactly.
I don't know if he was a tennis fan, but it's funny looking back at old archive TV. Sorry, just to go on a tangent. The duty of care, not just to viewers but to children in particular, is really lacking. I mean, we know there were horrific scandals about abuses of children, but the fact that when kids used to write into TV shows, they would read their entire address out. So if a child has just won a bike in a bicycle in a competition, everyone in the area would know there's going to be a new bike coming to that house very soon, and or if they'd won a computer or whatever, and that carried in well into the 80s, where there'd be someone would win. You often see in the clips of when Doctor Who stars are on Saturday morning TV. Those sort of shows where they'd say, and last week's competition, we're going to pull out a winner, and the winner is, and they'd read the whole address out. Really bad. So I'm not surprised that you can see Jerry Davis's full address on.
I think it's the kind of thing that was ordinarily blurred out, or maybe they figured that because Jerry Davis, number one, moved to Los Angeles, and number two had been dead for many years, they figured it was a archival point, so it wouldn't really hurt the family privacy if his address was shown 40 years later.
Yeah, nowadays they'd have to blur the address on the Tossers Lane gates just in case someone went there as well, I think.
I will be in London fairly soon. Is there actually a Totters Lane?
No.
Although it was mentioned in Doctor Who 2 weeks ago in The Devil's Cord.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
speaking of-
Totter's Lane, it's Junkyard Lane. That's what it means. So it's not a real place. Although, as you'll see, London has some very literal street names, including one that I'm not going to say out loud, but it begins with the word grope and ends with an obscene word for female genitalia, and that was literally where the prostitutes used to hang out. So that, I think, has been changed. It's been sanitized. But there's lots of street names have relevance to what happened there. But no, there isn't a Totter's Lane. Or certainly not one with a junkyard at the end of it.
I was going to say that in Devil's Court a couple of weeks ago, the Doctor explicitly makes reference to having lived at Totter's Yard in Shoreditch and points it out to Ruby from the roof of the EMI building. So again, that brings us back to Devil's Court, the Beatles, the Monoids, and the Ark. You and I had been talking about the Ark a few days ago online, and you said the following, which really fascinated me, and it's one of the reasons why I have you on this week. You said, although it isn't weird, Doctor Who has lasted so long that young men at the time of its birth can now be used in historical stories.
Yeah, it's funny that we're reaching the arc just after the Beatles have appeared in a Doctor Who pseudo-historical, because the Beatles were around, or they arrived just as Doctor Who arrived, within about a year. And when you think about like the Beatles as shown on TV, George Harrison is a couple of weeks away. I'm assuming that the timeline, even though it's a messed up timeline, I'm assuming that the recording of that first album, Please Please Me, happens at the same time as it did in our world. So it's February-ish 1963, which means that George Harrison is 2 weeks away from turning 20.
Wow. So he's still a teenager. Wow.
Cilla Black is also 19 at the time. I was so upset watching the actress who they cast as Cilla Black on the Unleashed episode. She's really good. I really wish she'd had more to do, because Cilla Black can be quite polarizing, especially because of her personality on TV in the 80s. But I love Cilla Black music. I really love her singing voice. I love everything about her. But the oldest Beatle would be Ringo, and he will turn 23 later on in the year. It's a scary fact that when the Beatles stopped being the Beatles, they weren't out of their 30s yet.
Oh, gosh. So how old would Brian Epstein and George Martin have been at this time?
George Martin is probably about 35.
Huh.
And I think Brian Epstein was still in his 20s as well. Considering he's only got the Beatles now, and I think he's got Cilla, but he's about to start getting a huge empire, mainly of beat groups. They're all male. Cilla's the only woman on his roster. She's the special one, but he's got so many other acts involved, and a lot of them are using songs written for them by Lennon and McCartney, like Jerry and the Pacemakers, and Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. I'm a bit of a fan of this era. I love this era. So when they said that they were going to be doing this era in Doctor Who, I was momentarily very excited. And then I realized they can't use a note of the music. And then I realized, that's going to be a plot point. But the one thing I was really nervous about with the Beatles was, are they going to get the accent right? Because we have examples of quite a few films where the people who are playing the Beatles are not from Liverpool, including one where George Harrison is played by a very young Peter Capaldi. So that's and when it comes to Liverpool accents, I get very hypersensitive. They were great. The only thing that I didn't really like was the fact that they all had blue eyes and all the Beatles had brown eyes, and I was expecting that to be a sort of hey, I'm not going to do the accent because a blend of Scottish and Rwandan is very difficult to do, quite apart from cultural appropriation. But when I was expecting the Doctor to say, they've got blue eyes, there's something wrong here. So that didn't happen. So maybe it did, and it's in my head canon from now on. Maybe that was a clue. But it was just the fact that the actors were really good, but they had blue eyes.
It just amazes me that you and I are quite a bit older than all these characters would have been in Devil's Court. I guess it goes to show that it takes babies to make history, although not space babies, if you catch my drift.
Spaced babies.
Spaced babies.
Although, actually, the Beatles didn't really get spaced until around about the time of the Ark. and then they got very spaced.
So how do the monoids hold up as villains? Is this an example of Doctor Who trying to take down youth culture? Is there any conversation to be had with the Beatles or the teens and 20-somethings of 1966? Or is the Ark just a cautionary tale about no matter how far in the future we get, and no matter how sophisticated we get, man is always going to be problematic?
I think it's that. It's just, I mean, there's a very, how can I phrase this without becoming the ghastly woke zombie that we all aspire to be? It took me far too long to realise that there is a way of reading the Ark which is very uncomfortable, which is you have a race of people who are effectively slaves, and then they are given parity, they are given equality, and then they overthrow their, in inverted commas, masters and take over and become cruel. And there are certain parallels to people who were opposing the civil rights movement, with saying, this is what will happen. So I worry about the fact that might be what they're saying is, the slaves will come and usurp us all, especially when, and this is a common problem with Doctor Who and also with sci-fi in general, this is the future of mankind. This is the future of humanity. And there isn't a single non-white face in the entire crew. So it's the Richard Pryor thing again of, do they know something we don't? With the Logan Drun. It's but putting that aside, I think the Ark is really funny, whether or not it's intentional or not. I think it's really funny. The fact that it's got a security kitchen, and I don't know yet because I haven't got to that point in the production diaries. I don't know if Paul Erickson wanted to have a security prison, and then they said, we don't have enough money for 2 sets, you've got to pick one, and he decided, I know, I'll make it a security kitchen. Or if he just went, let's make it a security kitchen, because that's really funny. It's so stupid, it's brilliant. And the idea of the monoids calling themselves one. Are you one? No, I'm two. Okay, I'm one. And in the book, we find out that there are generations of ones. There have been 17 ones since they took over, and similar number of fours. And the fours are always problematic and asking questions, and the ones are always trying to take over and lead. Nominative determinism. There's one other ghastly woke thing that I have to mention with the Ark, and it drives me mad. But it only drives me mad because I've studied British Sign Language. I'm not very good at it, but I can do very, very basic. The sign language that they use in the first episodes of this story is grossly offensive. It is so horrifically offensive because they're literally just making stuff up on the spot. There's no attempt to make it any kind of communication. They're just pointing and pulling faces. And that's just the monoids. We don't see proper British Sign Language until, is it Beneath the Lake? Before the Flood? The Peter Capaldi episodes?
I think it was Beneath the Lake after the Flood, I think.
Oh, okay. And that's the first time we see proper sign language. But again, it's because it's a plot point. That's a bit awkward as well. But the sign language they use in, okay, it's sci-fi, it's in the future, but there's no attempt to make it a real language. It's just two people making stuff up on the spot.
Under the Lake and Before the Flood. So Under the Lake was part 1, and Before the Flood was part 2.
You see, I'm very old. I can't remember the modern episode titles. They're just not in my head because I haven't had 40 years of reading Doctor Who magazine.
Exactly. I remember everything up through about series 2 or 3. I know the entire first 26 years, then seasons 2 or 3, and then I just can't remember it.
I know that there are some episodes from, let's say, in the Matt Smith era that I don't remember the titles, and I think it's because some of them I've renamed in my head, but I'm not going to tell you what I call them because it's obscene. But the one about the rings of someone singing about a leaf, just.
And then there are the episode titles that appear to be intentionally written to not be remembered, which is why I refer to the season finale of Chris Chibnall's first season as the Battle of Rumpelstiltskin.
That's as good as any other. I mean, that the flood, the season with that flood in, I still don't get the Magician's Apprentice and the Witch's Familiar, unless the Witch's Familiar is a pun and it's actually a contraction of the witch is familiar, rather than a possessive. But even so, that means nothing. But then I suppose he couldn't call it the Eyes of Davros.
That would have been a spoiler.
The Eyes of Davros, yeah. Speaking of eyes, aren't the monoids just brilliant? That ping pong ball eye in a mouth and the way it darts around is so eerie.
The Ark is one of those Hartnells that I saw in late 1985, early 1986, because it was one of the 17 surviving Hartnell serials that made the U.S. PBS syndication package. So the Ark is one of the last of those. I would have seen it probably in February or March 1986. I am 12, not even 12 and a half yet. I fell in love with the Hartnell era watching those black and white episodes in movie format on Saturday nights. And the Ark worked for me. Number one, you have the neat twist that they pivot halfway through the story. And the novelization actually puts the part 2 cliffhanger in the middle of chapter 5. So chapter 4 ends with the TARDIS leaving, whereas the Ark part 2 ends with the TARDIS coming back. You could actually release this as 2 books because the cliffhanger doesn't take place at the expected cliffhanger point, the end of chapter 4. They defer it. You could have released a 4-chapter chapbook for the Ark Part 1, and then a 4-chapter chapbook for the Ark Part 2, similar to how Dalek's Master Plan later becomes 2 full-size books. You could have released the Ark as 2 novellas.
That would be silly, though.
The acting is not great. The actor who plays Zentos and the actor who plays the commander in Part 1 are pretty terrible. But because Michael Imeson is the director and is putting all the money in visuals, visually this story holds up incredibly, incredibly well, even though it was made in 1966. And it goes back to my point about Doctor Who is at its best when it's being made by radical young people in their 20s trying to push the boundaries, which is not necessarily what's happening with the newest Disney Plus season.
And speaking of young radicals, we've got 2 people who are going to have a big influence in the future of Doctor Who in this, haven't we? We've got the first appearance of Michael Sheard, who's going to do 6 appearances overall, leading right up to Remembrance of the Daleks. And we've got Roy Skelton doing the voice of the monoids, which
That's right.
Just makes them... I love the monoids. I might have said that before. I love the monoids. I love the look of them. I love the voices of them. The big finish and BBC Books writer Jacqueline Rayner is also a huge fan of the monoids, which is why she did a Bernice Summerfield play, The Kingdom of the Blind, with the monoids in it. And also, when she got married, because I'm old friends with Jack, and when she got married, I made her 2 little monoids with the hair colours the same as her and her husband. Not to be on the cake because they're a bit heavy because they're made out of milliput, but just to sit next to the cake. So I made 2 little monoids for Jack Rayner's wedding.
That is adorable. The book, I think, plays into the themes very well because the book is able to make a lot more of the monoids watching and observing and getting ready to overthrow the humans. So you can tell from the first 4 chapters of the book, episodes 1 and 2, the monoids are resentful of how they've been treated and they're already planning to do something about it. That is most obvious in the scene with the boa constrictor in the Ark jungle and the lizard sunning itself on a flat rock in the desert. And the book also makes much more of the Doctor making clear to the humans in parts 3 and 4, you did this to yourselves and it's all your own fault because you were not wise rulers. You were not benevolent. You were cruel dictators who had the monoids at your mercy, and that's why this has happened to you. I think I was trying to make the point is mankind's own cruelty lays them low.
Yeah, and also you've got generations of the ones who are the ones who are trying to, they caused the usurpation of the human race, but you've got generations of the fours who aren't like that, and so it's not like they're all the same. It's funny that like the book has a few little changes that I mean, obviously the breadth of the book where you go out into the desert and you get to see nomads and you get all this massive scale of everything. That's fantastic. But the fact that the book undermines the sort of the casual nature that the TARDIS comes back, it's not coming back to the same location because they've gone 700 years, both in time and in space. But it's going to the same location in relative location. But in the book, it's blamed on Stephen knocking a lever, and he causes it.
Right.
So it's a lot less haphazard. It's a lot less coincidental, which I think is a shame because that's one of they've never really done that, have they? Since it's we're back in the same place unintentionally, and it's like they might come back to the especially in like Christopher Eccleston's era. They come back to locations and it's relevant, but it's not straight away. So I think that's a shame in the book.
It is something that the new series should do, where you have two back-to-back adventures in the same story. But yeah, I don't like the in-story explanation of Stephen pulling a Harry Sullivan on the TARDIS console. They should just arrive without any long metaphysical discussion of why they're there. So I think it is handled better on TV than in the book.
It's funny though that like we have this is the first arc, and then in Tom Baker's first year we have another arc, and it's another story where you have two stories separated by time in the same location, in the same arc. But at least they're separated by two other stories, so it's not quite so jarring.
Revenge of the Cybermen, of course, taking place on the same sets, but I believe Revenge of the Cybermen was filmed first, if I have that right.
Was it? Actually, I'm not sure.
I used to be able to see this in my head in the program guide, but now that I no longer have the program guide, I don't have the story codes the way that I used to.
I only know the funny story codes. Speaking of which, the Ark. The Ark is Doctor Who's first X-rated story. Production code X.
My mother was amused when I showed her in the program guide production code 4Q.
That's the best one.
And then, of course, there's OOO.
And Monster Peladon. Why? I think we've done this routine before, haven't we? I'm sure we did this routine before.
That Planet of the Spiders is quote-unquote 2 episodes too long. The story code is ZZZ. But the Scottish falsetto sock puppet theater on the Dominators DVD Extra already does the whole story code skit, so I'm not going to usurp that much funnier comedy.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Speaking of comedy, actually no, I'm not going to go there. Sorry, my brain just got fried at the sight of Smudge because you've been catified again. You've got a cat on your lap.
Most of the interviews that people do with me, they can see Smudge standing in front of me looking right into the webcam. So most interviews are done with Smudge, and I'm barely visible behind her.
It's a better sight than most cats tend to present. You usually get the rear end.
I do wonder what will happen if I time jump 700 years into the future. Will generations of Smudges have overthrown generations of Millers?
That's Red Dwarf, isn't it? That's basically the plot of Red Dwarf, which is also coming back. They're doing another little mini-series of Red Dwarf, and already the fans have seen production photos, and they're complaining that Crichton's mask doesn't look like it used to because he got old and fat.
I mean, Doctor Who in the 21st century does not have the same place in my life that it had in the 20th, because nothing will ever be as good as it was when you were 11 years old, and I was 11 when I discovered Doctor Who. I am now out of the target audience for the new series. It doesn't have the same impact for me. That being said, I'm never going to stop watching, but even if I have more nuanced reviews of these new episodes than people online who love them unreservedly, which I don't, I'm never going to be the guy going online saying, this is terrible, that's terrible. What's the point?
If it's terrible, stop watching it.
I can enjoy these new episodes on my own terms, even if I never want to watch Space Babies again, and even if I think that Boom was not as great as everyone seems to think it is. I was quite enamored of 73 Yards, perhaps because, like Michael Sheard in Castrovalva, I almost grasp it. To bring us back full circle to Michael Sheard. Roy Skelton, was he in Remembrance? Because that would have meant that he and Michael Sheard both begin Doctor Who in the Ark and both end Doctor Who in Remembrance.
He is. He does some of the Dalek voices. He's the Dalek voice when the Dalek is going up the stairs, and then it's is it Royce Mills or Brian Miller when the Dalek gets to the top of the stairs? They change the voice for some stupid reason. Huh. And also the Dalek says exterminate for a record number of times before it actually gets to the top of the stairs.
Which is kind of like the outtakes of Roy Skelton and the Five Doctors getting louder and louder and louder and louder.
Oh, that's beautiful, isn't it? And then the lovely little thank you at the end. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, Roy Skelton and Michael Sheard make their debut on their last episodes together.
Speaking of coming full circle, we are on Zoom, so we are down to the last 45 seconds of our recording. Do you have any pithy final words to tell us about the Ark and bring us home?
No. I'm just going to keep doing my monoid impression.
Jim Sangster, thanks so much. And the next time we are going to play a game where you cannot cheat.
Good luck with that. Bye.
Doctor Who, The Ark. Written by Paul Erickson. Televised as The Ark. Teleplay by Paul Erickson. Screen credit to Paul Erickson and Leslie Scott. Televised in March 1966. Paperback release date March 19th, 1987. Target book number 114. Cover artist David McAllister. It is 10 million years in the future, and the Earth is about to plunge into the sun. A gigantic space ark has been launched to take the last of humanity to a new life on the planet Refusus. Accompanying the humans on their journey are the monoids, strange reptilian creatures from an alien world. When the TARDIS materializes on board, the Doctor and his friends are greeted with suspicion, which soon turns to open hostility when Dodo inadvertently infects the Ark's crew with a long-forgotten virus. It is an accident which will have a terrible effect on mankind, an effect which will last for 700 years. Paul Erickson opens the prose in this, his only Doctor Who novel, with a one-word paragraph, jungle. There are 6 one-sentence paragraphs on the same first page, one of which is also a single word. The phrase Dark Shadows appears. The American TV soap opera of the same name did not premiere until about 3 months after the Ark, though was a well-known nostalgia magnet by the time the book came out in hardcover 20 years later. Meanwhile, on BBC One, the Ark premiered with a pretty poor 5.5 million viewer rating for the first week. It improved to 7.3 million by the end of the serial, but definitely showing that Dalek Mania was over. The prose in this book is overwritten and is not going to make anyone nostalgic, but it's hardly the least readable book in the target range, even if Chapter 1 uses words out of context like quivered, in reference to the Doctor looking at the TARDIS instrument console, or impregnated, in reference to the Guardian who gets punished by miniaturization, or even worse, ejaculated, in reference to the Doctor trying to shoo away a domesticated tiger, or, as Dodo calls it, ain't exactly a pussycat. Paul Erickson has clearly thought through his TV script, and is not merely turning the 20-year-old script into prose. he does make fixes, amendments, expansions, which makes his treatment of Dodo curious, because he gives us no context for who she is, even though this is her first full serial, and her only previous scene on the show, at the tail end of episode 4 of The Massacre, won't be out in book form for a while longer. This is Dodo's 4th novelization, so younger target readers will have recalled her from the Gunfighters, Celestial Toymaker, The Savages, but in story order, it would have been nice for Erickson, or the editors, to have explained just how she came to join the TARDIS crew. Erickson also establishes that the Hartnell Doctor has been traveling for at least 3 centuries, and alludes to unseen adventures on planets with dull names like Sava, and Inlandia, and Venetia, in a book that later features a character called Venussa. The new material begins on page 29. The Commander, played dreadfully on TV by Eric Elliott, takes the Doctor to the Ark's power chamber and describes the history of genetic modifications that ended aggression in both man and animal. Of course, the whole point of the story, the entire point Erickson is trying to make, is that man only thinks he's attained perfection, while his flaws follow him to the stars. There is, of course, the TARDIS Eruditorum reading of the story from 2011 as colonialist garbage, a reading to which I don't subscribe, but man in the 57th segment of time, as personified by the hostile Zentos, is no different from the 1966 man of Erickson's day, or the 2024 man of our day. And Stephen will even say as such in his terrific Episode 2 trial defense speech.
My contention is that it was no accident that this disaster has happened. I say that you came here intentionally to spread the disease.
Oh, that's utter nonsense. I mean, how can you
possibly... I
possibly...
say that you are agents of the planet towards which his spaceship is proceeding. That you came here to destroy us.
Why? We're human beings like you are. Why should we?
There's the crux of the matter. Do you expect us to believe that nonsense? That you, managed in that ridiculous machine called the TARDIS, have managed to travel through time? Guardians, monoids, these beings, whatever they are, place a heavy strain on our credulity.
Well, that's not very difficult. If your medical records are anything to go by, this segment of time, far from being one of the most advanced in knowledge, is one of the worst.
We can cope with all things known to the 57th segment of Earth life, but not with strange diseases brought by you as agents of the intelligences that inhabit Refusis.
You still on about that? I've told you before, we know nothing of that planet.
My instinct, every fiber of my being tells me differently.
That, unfortunately, tells me only one thing.
What's that?
That the nature of man, even in this day and age, hasn't altered at all. You still fear the unknown, like everyone else before you.
We'll revisit those themes in a moment. A lot of the dialogue in the book is nearly word for word identical to what we heard on television. This, I imagine, was copied over directly from whatever copies of the scripts Paul Erickson was working with. Except on page 37, the opening episode 2 scene, the Doctor, Dodo, and Stephen talking in their prison cell, and you know the one I mean. Jackie Lane going from, "I'm not sniveling, it's me nose running again," to, "I'm crying this time." There's a digression to Stephen talking about metaphysical means of escape, and the Doctor referencing Harry Houdini. I love me some Houdini. Grew up fascinated by stories of his death, which, unlike what the Doctor says in this scene, was not the result of drowning in a tank of water in an escape trick gone awry. That was Tony Curtis in the movie. Yes, Tony Curtis, back when Hollywood let Jewish actors play Jewish characters, but that's a rant for a whole nether day. So I'll just say here that had this dialogue been filmed for TV in 1966, it would have been the first canonical mention of Houdini in Doctor Who, an association that gets deeper and hotter and heavier every time a new Doctor mentions it, especially in the new series. Chapter 3, The Trial of the TARDIS Crew on the charges of being Refusian agents and intentionally infecting the Ark, lands very differently after 4 straight years of COVID denial. Zentos speaks for all those on the very noisy political fringe, but that is a heavy subject. Let's talk about interesting changes. On TV, the Commander overturns the trial verdict. In the book, Zentos reverses it himself after being shown that Dodo has antibodies that will cure the fever. 1966. when vaccines were considered a public good rather than public evil. On TV, the prosecutor for the Ark is a small part named Baku. There is no such character in the book, at least until a continuity error in the episode 4 material, which we'll come to. Zentos serves as prosecutor himself. And Hartnell's TV fluff, "This virus is more virulent than I suspected," reads as, quote, "This infection is more virulent than I suspected," page 46. Dodo's TV comparison of the monoid funeral procession to, quote, "savages" is thankfully lost. The Ark on TV is stunningly directed. It was the one Hartnell serial given the full chapter production diary treatment in the How Stammers Walker First Doctor handbook, and the only serial that Michael Imeson directed for Doctor Who. But boy, did he do an incredibly visual job, a production bursting at the seams with clever production techniques, and not quite sight gags, but visual transitions that do the work of dialogue. In the book, Erickson devotes Chapter 4 to the search for the vaccine to Dodo's common cold, or human coronavirus. That's basically what the story is, curing COVID's cousin. And if you're an anti-vaxxer who stumbled onto this podcast on Spotify after coming over from the Joe Rogan Experience, vaccines are a public good. And this story, again, hits differently when you realize that it was written not all that long after Jonas Salk's polio vaccine changed the course of the 20th century. In this chapter, Erickson narrates the Guardian's hunt for animals. That's done on TV as a silent montage, including a fascinating bit of business on pages 55 and 56, where a human Guardian is attacked by a boa constrictor, while the similarly reptilian monoid looks on and learns something. Page 57 has Dr. Rose, Michael Sheard's first Who character, using a 1980-style computer terminal, and page 58 indicates that the human Guardians are genetically modified to have 2 hearts, which begs a question about Time Lords and human biology. The monoid who assists the Doctor in the lab and starts mixing his own vaccines on page 60 is a bit like the Daleks in Lesterson's lab in the middle episodes of Power of the Daleks. Chapter 4 sees a visit to different climate zones on the Ark, a desert, complete with pyramids, a rustic farmhouse, and the Doctor takes time, as bodies drop like flies, to sit and chat with an old lady who preferred life on Earth, and fondly recalls the old ways. A visit to the polar ice caps zone, and an attacking polar bear, and an added subplot where Zentos spies on the Doctor and Rose from afar. This material takes us far from the TV plot and gives us dialogue and scope, and sets that the TV story would have had no time or money for at all. Zentos here, if you will, takes on the role of American Senator Rand Paul, Nepo baby from Kentucky, and dedicated to the proposition that it was the COVID vaccine that killed people, not COVID. Seen here when Zentos' spies blame the Doctor for virus deaths out on the Ark hinterland that occurred long before the Doctor arrived out there. The TARDIS crew are on the brink of being ejected into space, along with Michael Sheard's character, before the commander climbs off his sickbed and overrules Zentos. None of that was on TV. But it's a chilling subplot, especially because in real life Senator Paul has not yet had his Zentos change of heart moment. As we've heard during the interviews, Leland and Jim, Erickson here contrives to give an in-universe plot explanation for the TARDIS finding the Ark out 700 years later at the end of their journey. In the book, this is Stephen's fault. Stephen on page 79, believing that he can't still be feeling the after effects of the plague because the TARDIS is far away from the source of the plague. Hey Paul, that's literally not how viruses work. And Stephen ejaculates again on page 81. I do like, though, how Erickson teases for the TARDIS crew that things have gone off course for the Ark. The behaviorally modified tiger has overcome its conditioning and takes down a gazelle. That's good storytelling, even for a book that keeps using the word ejaculated. Better is on page 93, where a monoid literally, quote, exterminates a rebellious Guardian prisoner. One other change to Chapter 5. There's now a quote-unquote Grand Council of 20 monoids in the meeting that decides to send the shuttle down to Refusis. On TV, there are not 20 monoids, suffice to say, not on a 1966 budget in a small studio. So it is Monoid 9 in the book who leads the landing party to Refusus, not Monoid 2 as on TV. Chapter 6 expands considerably on the TV with more sets and more characters. A female Refusian shows up to help Dodo try on clothes. She names herself Mary, and Richard Beale's Monoid as Charles, reaching back 56 segments of time to choose the names of old British monarchy. Dodo and Mary play a game of tennis, Erickson informing us that Dodo had been all-county tennis champion back home. Later on, the Doctor plays chess with Monoid Charles. Erickson doesn't call Dodo a chess champion, but does have her sabotage the Doctor's game with intentionally bad advice, so that Charles, or as Dodo calls him, Charlie, can win. And we physically see Charles destroy the lander, rather than have it explode off-screen as on TV. The Doctor spends a lot more time being Dodo's grumpy uncle, correcting her grammar and syntax in a way that became obsolete on TV, following Dodo's BBC-enforced accent-changing code switch, as Jim told us about earlier. In Chapter 7, the security kitchen guardian, Dasik, suddenly becomes Baku on page 119, assuming the role that Dasik did on TV of sneaking out of the kitchen and helping the other Guardians escape to search for the Monoid's bomb. I chalk this up to a continuity error on Erickson's part, not caught by the editing. Baku doesn't appear elsewhere in the book, reverting back to good old Dasik in later chapters. The Doctor and Dodo play a more pivotal role in this chapter, getting Monoid 1 to reveal where the bomb is. On TV, 1 carelessly relays that information to the rebellious 4. This is a decent book. It expands on the themes of the TV story and adds lots of new scenes. It is not a top-tier target, Erickson's prose being okay but not particularly dazzling. But one of my favorite expansions comes in Chapter 8 as an imprisoned Dodo and the Doctor pass the time by playing Snakes and Ladders. 1, this is awesome if you're reading the books in story order, because in the next story, The Celestial Toymaker, already covered in episode 110 of this podcast, that's exactly one of the games Dodo has to play against the Toymaker's minions. She plays it better here. And second, the Monoid prison guard here is offended by the game, being reptilian himself, noting that the snakes in the game should be for climbing up to advance, not for sliding down toward defeat. More detail and deaths are added to the fight between the two factions of Monoids, 1s and 4s, with 4 in the book having much more egalitarian attitudes towards the Guardians. The Doctor in the book stops to help fix 4's broken leg, earning the friendship of that Monoid faction, a moment not shown on television. Another brief subplot is added as the one Monoid who can help the humans deactivate the bomb is killed, trying to return to the Ark in one of the launchers, adding an extra moment of tension to the episode 4-wide search for that bomb. Erickson gets in a good chase scene on pages 138 and 139. Monoid 18, an ally of Rebel Faction Leader 4, chases 1 till the latter's death through the woods and down a river and up to the edge of a waterfall. Quote, "At the end of the ravine, the river tumbled over rocks into a waterfall. Number 1 paused, seeing a cave on the other side, and judging that he was far enough ahead of his pursuer, he started scrambling over the rocks to try and reach its safety. Number 18 paused and carefully leveled up, the aim of his weapon, a searing flash, and while the shot did not hit his quarry squarely, it sideswiped him and knocked him off balance. Number 1 screamed as he plunged over the lip of the waterfall, and his body contorted as he fell into the swirling waters, hundreds of feet below." All this wraps up the Monoid Civil War, much more satisfactorily than could have been staged on television. And coming full circle, Erickson in the book resurrects the Guardian who'd been punished with miniaturization in episode 1, with the Doctor welcoming him back to civilization with a kind benediction, "Go and live your life to the full, as you were intended to," page 142. While the Ark aspires to be hard science fiction, with its colony ship, alien civil war, invisible Refusians, and the high-tech Ark with multiple climate zones and instant potatoes, there are some things it kind of glosses over, like how the Guardians and Monoids limited their full-size population after 700 years, and presumably 28 generations. Perhaps many more were miniaturized and sent into storage along the way, Or maybe we're left to assume that the various rounds of plague and punishments limited their populations naturally, or how the Guardian language didn't evolve over 700 years. If you were miniaturized in London, or especially what is now New York, in 1324, and brought back to full size today, not a chance you'd understand the language. But those are minor points. The Ark as a novelization does its best to improve the TV story in print, and gives us plenty of new material to chew on. I will not punish this book by sending it to my security kitchen, and I won't make it invisible like the Refusians. Dot and Bubble. I'm in Florida this weekend on a solo business trip, so could not watch the new episode with Callie, as it dropped on Disney Plus on Friday night New York time, as has become our tradition this season. But she did give me leave to watch it myself, with instructions to watch it again with her when I get home, or, if it wasn't any good, to just give her the major plot points before she rejoins next week's episode. So I watched myself in a hotel room in South Florida on the Friday night. The episode got off on the wrong foot with me, as for much of the running time it appeared to be a mean-spirited look at what a 60-year-old man thinks of youth culture, influencers, literal social media bubbles, disposable pop music, the itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny yellow polka dot bikini, the 1960 brill-building sound proto-bubblegum pop classic used in the episode, a song so old that it's 3 years older than RTD himself, has been lodged in my head like Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s dead brainworm for 24 hours straight. Ncuti Gatwa's second episode, this becomes another Dr. Light tale, as he was wrapping up work on sex education, so only appears live in one scene, and by pop-up zoom window for his remaining moments. Callie Cook as Lindy, the de facto lead. I'm a fan of anyone named Callie. And Tom Rhys-Harries, who plays surprisingly deep pop star Ricky September, are both talents to keep an eye on. This sort of pop culture critique would not work without a twist. There is a twist. The people the Doctor is trying to save, with the exception of Ricky, are the real monsters, and they're being consumed by the episode's puppet monster slugs is a literal expression of the term eat the rich. Ricky's death is the sort of tragic death of a side character that the classic series did so well, the new series less so. This is a recycled plot premise that RRTD first pitched in 2010, so in comparison to Black Mirror's 16 Million Merits, which starred a young Daniel Kaluuya soon after his missed opportunity cameo in Planet of the Dead, is a bit coincidental, but Lindy's rejection of the 15th Doctor now works as an allusion to racism in a way that it wouldn't have worked quite as well if delivered to Matt Smith as originally intended. The episode is broad black comedy, and as unsubtle as it gets. Would have been right at home in the Cartmel era. I'll show it to Callie, as I think she'd easily spot all the cultural and societal critiques, an episode that starts off slamming kids, which, if you ask me, is a bad idea. This is the same generation that, at least here in the States, has survived the pandemic, the school shooting epidemic, a televised insurrection in 2021. These kids are much tougher than my generation ever was. But then, the story turns the critique right back around, as the rich literally get eaten by slugs. Next time, on Doctor Who Literature, we stay in the past. We jump ahead slightly from Season 3 to Season 6, The Mind Robber. I'll be joined by old friend of the program, Adam Clegg, from the Real McCoy podcast, and we're going to talk about the land of fiction, and hopefully the two new adventures that also take place in the land of fiction, Conundrum and Head Games by Steve Lyons. Next week on Doctor Who Literature, you can follow us on Spotify or in the hourly telepress right underneath the latest comic strip adventures of the Carcass. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. The podcast is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Jim Sangster. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. All past episodes are at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.